The heart of this existence is unity, where we see, perceive, mistake plurality. And when you start to develop the intellect, you start to just notice, wow, that's the decision I would have made a few weeks ago. Welcome back to another reflection on the daily Vedantic. And today's reflection, in many ways, is at the root of the entirety of the philosophy of Vedanta. A call for us to overcome our minds. But the three radical concepts that this philosophy is built on, the first is that there is a supreme being. If you grew up in a religious household, that won't be news to you, won't be a novel concept to you. But that is a pretty radical concept. To say that there is something beyond what we are seeing that is supreme to it all. Second radical concept within Vedanta is that what we are seeing, what we are perceiving, is illusory. A projection of the mind. Technically speaking, you would say it's a projection of ignorance, but the turn of phrase that is often used is a projection of our minds. Much like the dream, where every night we go to bed, create entire worlds that we perceive as real, where we touch, hit, feel, perceive, see, hear, interact with other people around drama that we don't even know how it's going to unfold, and yet that is a complete projection of our mind. And what this philosophy says is that this, in a very radical way, is that this is an elevated version of that. The third radical concept is that, going back to that supreme being, this philosophy says, you are that. Who you really are. Not this limited identity, not this body, not this mind. Who you really are is that. I know how radical these sound, especially when you combine them. But that is the heart of this philosophy. And in terms of continuous study, the oldest philosophical concepts on the planet. So they might be new to us, but they're not new. And each major tradition weaves very similar concepts within them, whether it's Christianity and Ecclesiastes saying, this is all vapor. All is vapor. Whether it is Judaism and Kabbalah, the non-dual tradition, or Islam and Sufism, the non-dual tradition within Islam, where they're saying not to. The world, this existence, is not to, is non-dual. In other words, this existence, the heart of this existence is unity, where we see, perceive, mistake plurality. The heart of all of these non-dual traditions is oneness, is unity in the midst of perceived plurality. So to perceive reality, what does this philosophy call us to do? It calls us to overcome our mind. The insanely powerful mind. Christ's first public words, which were mistranslated in 400 AD by St. Jerome into repent. The actual Greek was metanoite. We don't know what the original Aramaic was, but the Greek translations up until 400 AD, that is very easy to see still to this day. The Greek translation was metanoite, which means to overcome one's mind. His first public words that we have record of is to overcome your mind. How do we overcome our minds? Well, the three equipments that this philosophy and this podcast will talk about over and over again to navigate the world are your body, your mind, and this other internal equipment, the intellect. If the highest calling is to overcome one's mind, how do we do that? Well, the two internal equipments we have are a mind and an intellect. Intellect is more subtle. It is what discerns real from unreal. It's what judges. It's what can deliberate back and forth within oneself on what you should do in a given scenario. The mind is where our likes, our dislikes, our preferences, our emotions sit. But the intellect can jump in and say, yeah, that's the emotion, or that's the like, that's the dislike, but this is what we're doing anyhow. It's the, quote unquote, the adult in the room. And children are amazing. Our 6-year-old, unbelievable. It's so fun to have our 6-year-old around, especially right now. It's just so fun to interact, play games, have real conversations with a 6-year-old or a 3-year-old to some degree. But our 6-year-olds, it's amazing to have a child around, but you wouldn't leave a child at home alone. Similarly, the intellect is there to guide the mind. The last few episodes I've been talking about listening for people, prompting people to listen to the intro episode of this podcast. If you haven't listened to it in a while, the intro, listen to it again. And it gives a great outline of the body, the mind, the intellect. But in this distinction between the mind and the intellect is what comes in and subdues the mind, overcomes the likes and the dislikes, the wayward temptations of what the mind, what a 5-year-old or 6-year-old would do if there was no adult present in their existence. Luckily, we have this adult that's ever present, right there watching. So what do you do with that on a day-to-day practical basis? Study and reflect each day to cultivate and develop that intellect, to strengthen it like any muscle. And it will take years. But you'll notice progress within days, within weeks. Study reflecting each morning, ideally before the sun comes up. It is the training of your intellect like you would train your body. And it might take 2 or 3 years to train the physical body to where it's really capable. It can take 15, 20 years to train the mind. It's not coincidence that everywhere around the world, typically the educational systems globally go till about 18. So it takes 15 to 20 years to train the mind. It can take longer to train the intellect. But around 15 years old, the intellect starts to come online. It's there to be developed. But like the body, if you don't put your attention towards developing it, then it won't develop. But as Socrates said, what a shame it is for man to reach the end of his life never realizing the capacity of the human body. Similarly, and maybe more powerfully, what an even greater shame it would be to reach the end of your life, never realizing the capacity of a developed intellect. The adult in the room that knows exactly what to do, how to do it, why, and the when in any scenario in life. Mastering the art of living well. Mastering the art of service to those around you and to yourself. And when we do develop that intellect, as the Bhagavad Gita outlines, the most important work we do for others is the work we do on ourselves. That's what makes us a wellspring of service for decades to the communities around us. When we do the work on ourselves and when we develop that intellect. It is amazing to see what happens. It's kind of like I started to do yoga much more deliberately about a year ago. Physical yoga, hatha yoga. The least classical of the classical yogas. Hatha yoga, which to us in America, that's kind of, there's only one yoga. It's the one where you're standing on your head. To Indians, they're like, no, there's the classical yogas are karma, bhakti, jnana yoga. Hatha yoga, that's like, if you can't do those, then you do hatha yoga. But it's a great practice to keep the body supple, to keep your limbs firm. And within about 3 or 4 weeks, it was amazing just how stable my feet were when walking, picking up our little girls and strange articulations of the body, needing to lift up things. And it was so interesting walking the half mile to my office and back. It was interesting just to feel the stability in my feet, all of the muscles in the feet kind of coming online together within weeks, about 3 weeks of starting to deliberately do hatha yoga and develop that side of my physicality. That is so similar to a few weeks into developing the intellect. A muscle that you might be hearing for the very first time right now that you have. An equipment within you that no disciplines talk about. Modern psychology barely scratches the surface, talking about dual systems thinking in the last 5-10 years. They've started to discover that we are not monological thinkers. We don't think in linear monologues. We actually think in dialogues. But the Vedantic articulation just makes that far more explicit of it's not just dialogical, but there is a higher, more subtle equipment attuned to your spiritual evolution and progress called the intellect, and a lower, much more preferential, emotional equipment in the mind. And when you start to develop the intellect, you start to just notice, wow, that's the decision I would have made a few weeks ago. Now I'm going to make this one because it is far better for me in the long run. Because the Vedantic definition of the intellect is the capacity to see the end in the beginning. And when you develop that capacity, you see through time, through obstacles, through challenges. You can see the end in the beginning. And you can overcome your mind. That is today's reflection in the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.